Have you ever been sitting quietly in a room where contracts are signed, millions are discussed, and futures are decided, only to realize that somehow you no longer exist to the people around you, even though you're right there breathing the same air? That was the thought that crossed my mind the second my daughter-in-law leaned toward me, her smile sharp enough to cut, and said in a voice meant to sound reasonable but dripping with certainty that I wasn't listed anywhere on the $64 million deed, as if that single sentence erased decades of my life in one breath. And before I could even process the weight of those words, the room seemed to tilt as she shoved my chair back, the cold marble floor biting into my palms when I lost my balance. The sound of my purse hitting the ground echoing louder than her voice, louder than the silence that followed, because what stunned me wasn't the shove. It was the fact that no one moved, no one gasped, no one objected. Not the realtor in his tailored suit frozen mid-step, with his pen hovering uselessly over a leather folder. Not the lawyers shifting uncomfortably in their chairs. Not the investors pretending to check their phones, as if humiliation were a private inconvenience rather than a public act unfolding right in front of them. And in that moment, I understood something chilling. Humiliation doesn't need an audience willing to participate, it only needs an audience willing to look away. And as I slowly pushed myself upright, smoothing my coat with hands that refused to shake, I felt every eye glance at me and then dart away, as if acknowledging me might contaminate the polished perfection of the deal they were so eager to close. And that's when my son finally turned, not rushing to help. Not even asking if I was all right, but offering a look so distant and flat it felt rehearsed, like a line he'd practiced in his head. Telling me calmly that I was too old to understand real estate anyway, and that I shouldn't waste everyone's time. And it struck me then that being dismissed by strangers hurts. But being dismissed by your own child rewrites something inside you permanently, because the air in that glass-walled office suddenly felt heavy, thick with expensive coffee and polished wood and unspoken agreement that I was an inconvenience best moved out of sight. Which is exactly what my daughter-in-law did next when she dragged my chair away from the center of the table and shoved it into the farthest corner, away from the sunlight, away from the documents, away from where decisions were made, leaning down just enough to hiss that I was nothing more than a tenant in their home now, and that once the estate was finalized, I'd never step foot there again. And maybe I should consider a nursing home if I found all of this too confusing. And as cruel as those words were, what stayed with me was the ease with which she said them, like she was stating a fact everyone already accepted. And maybe they did, because as I picked up my purse, walked to the corner she'd chosen for me, and sat down without a word, no one stopped the meeting, no one asked if we should pause. And the realtor simply cleared his throat and resumed explaining the order of signatures as if I had evaporated. Pens began scratching across paper, glasses of water were lifted and set down, chairs shifted, deals progressed. And life moved on seamlessly without me, even though I was still sitting there watching every movement, memorizing every face. Noticing how my son leaned forward eagerly whenever numbers were discussed, and how my daughter-in-law's lips curled with satisfaction as signatures appeared one by one, confident that she had already won. Confident that the woman in the corner no longer mattered, and maybe to them I looked harmless, quiet, irrelevant, just an old woman folded into the shadows with her hands neatly clasped in her lap. But inside my head their words replayed over and over, not on the deed, too old to understand tenant. Nursing home, each phrase settling not like a fresh wound, but like another entry in a ledger I had been keeping far longer than they realized, because I've learned that the most dangerous mistakes people make aren't fueled by hatred. They're fueled by certainty, the certainty that someone won't fight back, won't notice, won't remember. And as I sat there, half in shadow, I made a choice they couldn't see, a choice to remain perfectly still, perfectly silent, letting them believe that moving me to the corner meant they had removed me from the equation entirely, because silence has a strange way of disarming people. It makes them sloppy, it makes them careless. It makes them reveal who they truly are. And as the final pages were passed around and the realtor glanced at the empty space where my signature wasn't yet placed, I allowed myself the smallest private smile. Not because I felt victorious, far from it, but because I knew something they didn't, something that made every insult, every shove, every dismissive glance feel premature. And as I looked around that room full of confident people convinced they were in control, one thought anchored itself calmly in my chest. This meeting wasn't over yet, not even close, because sometimes the person sitting in the corner isn't there because they've lost. Sometimes they're there because they're waiting, and what they're waiting for changes everything. They thought pushing me into the corner ended my role in the room, but that was only the moment I stopped playing by their assumptions. Have you ever noticed how people don't push you out all at once, but inch by inch, until one day you look around and realize there's no space left for you to stand? That realization didn't come to me in the closing room. It came long before, quietly, inside the walls of the house I once believed was mine, back when I still thought respect disappeared suddenly instead of dissolving slowly. Because the truth is, I didn't wake up one morning as a stranger in my own home. I was carefully rebranded over time, reduced piece by piece until I barely recognized the role they'd assigned me. And it started with small things that were easy to dismiss if you weren't paying attention, like the first time my daughter in law introduced me to her friends, and instead of saying I was her husband's mother, she smiled brightly and called me the housekeeper, letting their polite laughter hang in the air while she never corrected them. And I remember standing there with a tray of tea warming my palms, my mouth opening to speak and then closing again. Because interrupting would have made me look awkward, not her, and that was the trick. Every humiliation dressed up just politely enough that responding felt like bad manners, and once she realized silence followed, it became a habit, spreading into everything else, from the way my opinions were brushed off as outdated to the way my presence was treated like background noise, especially when guests were over. Because nothing makes you feel invisible faster than being talked around instead of talked to. And then there was the garden, the small patch of earth I had cared for long before they moved in, where my hands knew the soil the way memory knows pain. And when I noticed my vegetables tossed into the compost bin, perfectly good food discarded like it had no value. And she shrugged and said she didn't trust anything that wasn't store certified. It wasn't really about lettuce or tomatoes. It was about declaring that even the ground I'd worked my whole life was somehow beneath her standards. And I tried to tell myself it was harmless, that young people have their ways, until I brought home that oak dining table I'd found at an estate sale, solid, heavy, the kind of furniture meant to survive generations, and polished it until it glowed, only for her to laugh and say it looked like firewood, and the next day it vanished, replaced by cold glass and chrome that reflected faces but held no warmth. And I remember thinking then that objects were easier to erase than people, but people weren't far behind, because soon after, my son sat me down with papers and a tone he must have practiced, explaining that I'd now be responsible for my own utilities since I had my own room. Like I was a tenant renting space, instead of the woman who had quietly paid off the last of the mortgage years earlier so they wouldn't lose the house, a fact no one seemed interested in remembering anymore. And that's when I understood something important. Gratitude has an expiration date when people feel entitled, because what once counted as sacrifice slowly becomes invisible once it no longer benefits them. And when my son suggested I sell my wedding ring to help with investments, speaking of it like scrap metal instead of a lifetime worn smooth by love and loss, and she called me selfish for refusing, something settled in my chest. Not anger, not grief, but clarity, the kind that arrives when you realize kindness without boundaries doesn't make you generous, it makes you convenient, and convenience is the first step toward disposability. And the final proof came when I got sick. Nothing dramatic at first, just a cough that wouldn't leave and a fever that refused to break, until I landed in the hospital for a week. And while I lay there thinking about my own bed in the quiet corner I'd carved out for myself, decisions were made without me, because when I returned, weak and still pale, my door was closed, a stranger's suitcase in the hall. And she explained casually that they'd rented out my room while I was gone to help with expenses, and I could stay in the basement for now, as if basements were temporary inconveniences instead of statements. And when I struggled to understand how my space could disappear while I was fighting to breathe, my son said the words that sealed everything. That the rent helped them feed one less mouth and I should be grateful. And if you've never felt your worth reduced to a line item in someone else's budget, I can tell you it doesn't scream, it sinks. It settles deep and quiet, and that night, lying on a narrow bed beside the hum of a water heater, listening to laughter float down from above while guests enjoyed the rooms that once felt like home, I finally stopped asking myself what I had done wrong. Because the pattern was suddenly clear. This wasn't about misunderstanding or stress or money. It was about power, about rewriting history until I became a favor instead of a foundation. and as every insult replayed in my mind. I didn't cry, I didn't argue, I didn't confront them because something inside me had shifted, and I realized that people who underestimate you don't need to be corrected immediately. They need to be observed, studied, allowed to reveal themselves fully, because silence, when chosen intentionally, isn't surrender, it's preparation. And as I lay there staring at the basement ceiling, I began keeping track, not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. Because I understood that one day every small dismissal would matter, every careless word would connect, and the woman they believed was shrinking into nothing was actually learning exactly where the cracks were forming. By the time they finished reducing me to nothing, I had already learned exactly how much damage nothing could do. Have you ever realized that the moment people decide you're an inconvenience is the moment they stop asking for your permission altogether? I didn't understand that truth until the day I came home from the hospital, carrying nothing but a small bag and the hope that my own bed would steady me again, because illness has a way of stripping you down to your most basic needs. And all I wanted was rest, quiet, and familiarity. But instead, I found a closed door where my room used to be, and a stranger's suitcase sitting comfortably in the hallway like it had always belonged there. And when I asked what was going on, my daughter in law explained it the same way someone might explain changing a light bulb, telling me they had rented out my room while I was away because the extra income helped with expenses and that I could stay in the basement for now. And if you've ever been too tired to argue, you know how the body goes still while the mind races, because the words didn't register at first, not until I realized she was talking about my room, the only space I still recognized as mine in that house. The place where my husband's photograph sat on the dresser and the sunlight hit just right in the mornings. And suddenly it was gone, not because I'd moved out, not because I'd agreed, but because I had been sick and therefore absent, and absence, I learned, is permission for people who already see you as temporary. And when I tried to say something, my son appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, explaining that the rent money helped feed one less mouth and that I should be grateful they were still letting me stay at all. And there's a particular kind of pain that comes from being told you should feel thankful for your own displacement, because it flips reality on its head and dares you to argue without sounding unreasonable. And that's how I found myself carrying my bag down to the basement, past the framed family photos I suddenly no longer appeared in, past the living room where laughter had returned as if nothing had changed, and into a space of unfinished concrete that smelled faintly of dampness and neglect, where the air stayed cold even in summer and the hum of the water heater became my nighttime companion. And that first night, lying there staring at the low ceiling, listening to glasses clink above me as guests dined and celebrated in the rooms I used to keep warm, something fundamental shifted, because it wasn't just about losing a bedroom, it was about losing proof that I belonged. And when belonging disappears quietly, it leaves you questioning whether it was ever real at all. And I thought about the years I'd spent paying bills, cooking meals, smoothing tensions, stepping back so others could move forward, and how easily all of that had been rewritten into a narrative where I was a burden instead of a backbone. And maybe you felt that too. The moment you realize your contributions have been absorbed into the background while your presence is suddenly too much, and what hurt most wasn't the basement or the cold or the way my knees ached climbing those stairs. It was the certainty in their voices, the ease with which they spoke as if this arrangement made perfect sense, as if the house had always been theirs and I had always been temporary, and that certainty was dangerous. Because people who feel justified don't hesitate, they don't second guess, they don't imagine consequences, and as I lay there night after night, replaying every word, every shrug, every dismissive glance, I stopped asking myself how to fix the situation and started asking a different question. What would happen if I stopped trying to prove my worth to people who had already decided it didn't exist? And that question changed everything. Because the moment you stop trying to be seen by those who benefit from ignoring you is the moment you begin seeing them clearly. And I noticed how freely they spoke when they thought I couldn't hear. How casually my daughter-in-law joked about shipping me off one day, how my son avoided my eyes unless he needed something, how comfort had made them careless, and carelessness reveals more than cruelty ever could. And as the basement became my world, I let it because invisibility has its advantages. It gives you time, perspective, and most importantly, it gives people the illusion that you are no longer paying attention. And by the time they settled into their certainty that I would accept whatever corner they assigned me, I had already stopped seeing myself as displaced and started seeing myself as positioned. Because sometimes being pushed down isn't about humiliation, it's about being placed exactly where you can watch everything without being noticed, and lying there in the dark, listening to the steady hum above me. I understood something I wish I'd learned earlier. When people believe they've taken everything from you, they stop guarding what they have, and that is when the balance begins to shift. They thought the basement was the end of my story, but it was the first place I could finally see the whole picture clearly. Have you ever noticed that the moment people decide you're powerless is the moment they stop watching you carefully? That realization settled over me slowly during those basement days, not as anger but as a strange calm, because once you stop expecting fairness from people who benefit from your silence, you start seeing opportunity where you once felt trapped, and that's when I understood why reacting, arguing, or demanding respect would have changed nothing. Because outrage would have only confirmed the role they'd already written for me, the bitter old woman who couldn't let go. But silence, intentional silence, did something far more useful. It made them comfortable, careless, and generous with their true selves. And while they moved through the house above me convinced they had everything under control, I was quietly taking inventory of the past, starting with the man who had once made this house feel like a home. My husband, whose absence still echoed in ways no one else seemed to notice, because grief doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it just sits with you in the quiet moments. Like when you're folding clothes that will never be worn again or sorting through papers that feel heavier than they should. And it was during one of those nights, sitting alone at a small desk in the basement, that I came across his insurance policy. The one he'd insisted on keeping even when money was tight, telling me it was for later, for when things went wrong. And when the check finally arrived weeks after his passing, it felt strangely impersonal, just numbers on paper. But I understood immediately what it represented. Not rescue, not revenge, but choice. And the most important choice I made was not telling anyone, because people treat you very differently once they believe you have nothing. And being underestimated is a powerful kind of freedom if you know how to use it. So I let my son and his wife assume whatever they wanted, let them believe my resources were small and fading. Let them think the basement was the natural end of my story, because that belief shaped their behavior in ways that benefited me. It made them bolder, crueler, and more honest about who they were, and that honesty was valuable. Because it showed me exactly what I was dealing with, and once I understood that, I knew I needed help, not emotional support, not validation, but someone who knew how to move quietly through systems designed to protect the powerful. And that's when I thought of Ruth, a childhood friend I hadn't spoken to regularly in years, but one thing about her had never changed. She valued discretion above everything else, and when I reached out, I didn't explain my pain or my family or the basement. I simply told her I wanted to protect what I had in a way no one could touch or trace, and she didn't ask why. She only asked how much and how invisible I wanted to be, and that question told me I'd chosen the right person. Because people who understand power don't need emotional justifications, they understand outcomes. And over the next few months, while life above me continued as usual, something entirely different was taking shape beneath the surface: layers of protection, distance, and anonymity that ensured my name would never appear where curiosity might land. And the more I built that separation, the more I understood why patience frightens people who rely on force or entitlement. Because patience allows you to move without resistance, to prepare without interference, and to act without warning, and I let myself shrink visibly while growing strategically. Played the part of the tired old woman who stayed out of conversations and asked for nothing, because asking invites scrutiny, and scrutiny invites obstruction. And by the time my daughter-in-law began speaking openly about the kind of future she deserved, the house she would own, the people she would no longer have to tolerate, I had already stopped seeing those words as threats and started seeing them as confirmations, proof that my silence was working exactly as intended, because nothing exposes arrogance faster than the belief that no one is watching. And as the months passed, I stopped feeling like I was waiting for something to happen to me and started feeling like I was waiting for the right moment to act, because weakness, when performed convincingly, is one of the most effective disguises there is, and I wore it carefully, knowing that when the time came, the shock wouldn't come from what I did, but from who they never imagined could do it. They mistook my silence for surrender, never realizing it was the cover I needed to move everything into place. Have you ever wondered how many decisions are made about your future while you're being dismissed as irrelevant? Because while my daughter in law strutted through the house above me talking about upgrades, views, and the kind of life she believed was finally within reach, something very different was unfolding far away from that basement. Something she never thought to question, because people who feel entitled rarely imagine someone else might already be seated at the table they're racing toward, and that's the advantage of being invisible. You're not competing, you're positioning. And once the structure Ruth helped me put in place was complete, my life split cleanly into two versions, the one they saw and the one that mattered because on paper nothing had changed. I was still the quiet old woman keeping to herself, eating simply, asking for little, but behind layers of distance and protection, something else was taking shape, something patient and deliberate, built not to impress but to endure. And I learned quickly that ownership doesn't always look like a name on a sign. Sometimes it looks like percentages, voting rights, quiet influence that never needs to announce itself, and that's how the investments began. Small enough not to attract attention, spaced carefully so no pattern could be traced, spread across companies that built things other people dreamed of owning, and one of those companies, by coincidence so perfect it still makes me smile, was the very firm responsible for developing the estate my son and his wife would soon become obsessed with. And obsession changes people. It makes them loud, careless, and blind, especially when they believe the finish line is already theirs. Because when my daughter in law started talking about finally living where we belong, she spoke as if the world owed her a setting worthy of her ambition, and my son nodded along, confident that momentum was on their side. Never once imagining that momentum can be guided quietly from behind the scenes. And as the months passed, my holdings grew steadily, never enough to put my face anywhere public, but enough to ensure that nothing significant moved forward without my consent. And there's a particular comfort in knowing that people who look down on you are unknowingly depending on you, because dependence changes the balance long before anyone realizes it has shifted. And I listened carefully when they talked about deposits, loans, and how frustrating it was that they didn't quite have the liquid cash to move fast enough, because speed matters to people who want to outrun doubt. And that impatience is often the opening, the place where confidence becomes vulnerability. And when Ruth told me the exact percentage I now held, I didn't feel triumphant, I felt calm. Because control doesn't announce itself with fireworks, it settles in quietly like a tide that's already turned. And the best part was knowing that nothing I'd done could be traced back to me, because anonymity isn't about hiding out of fear. It's about removing leverage, about ensuring that when people finally realize the truth, there's nothing they can threaten you with, nothing they can take. And from that moment on, every conversation I overheard above me carried a different weight. Because when my daughter in law bragged about the estate to friends on the phone, laughing about how some stupid seller would never see them coming, I knew exactly how much of that confidence rested on assumptions she'd never bothered to verify. And when my son joked that maybe he'd let me stay in a guest room someday if I behaved myself, I didn't flinch, because it's much easier to tolerate condescension when you know it's temporary. And I let them believe their dream was unfolding naturally, that luck and timing were finally on their side, because nothing dulls suspicion faster than success that feels deserved, and all the while I watched the numbers, the reports. The slow but steady alignment of pieces that would make one simple decision far more powerful than any argument I could have raised, because influence doesn't need permission, it only needs patience. And as their excitement grew and their certainty hardened, I understood that the hardest part wasn't building control, it was waiting long enough to use it properly, because timing isn't just about when you act. It's about when the other side is least prepared to imagine you acting at all. By the time they started calling it their dream house, the truth was already set. Nothing about that dream moved without me. Have you ever noticed how people stop reading once they believe they're finally winning? That was the moment I'd been waiting for, the moment confidence outruns caution, because when my son and daughter-in-law began talking openly about deposits and deadlines, about how the estate was slipping through their fingers because they didn't quite have the liquid cash to secure it fast enough, I recognized the tone immediately. It wasn't worry, it was impatience, the kind that makes people skim instead of study, nod instead of question, and when Ruth suggested that the trust could step in as an anonymous financial backer, I didn't hesitate, not because I wanted to rescue them, but because leverage only works when it feels like help. And the offer was presented exactly that way, clean, professional, generous enough to solve their problem but distant enough to avoid curiosity. and they accepted it with the ease of people who believe assistance is owed to them, barely glancing at the terms before congratulating themselves on their good fortune, because in their minds this wasn't a deal, it was destiny finally aligning, and destiny, as they understood it, never came with fine print worth worrying about. And that fine print was where everything lived, because the agreement was simple on the surface. The trust would provide the initial deposit to secure the estate, smoothing the path to ownership, but buried carefully in the language was a condition so precise they never imagined it could matter, that if the trust chose not to release the remaining funds at any point before final closing, the entire transaction would collapse and the deposit would be forfeited. No appeals, no extensions, no explanations required. And my son skimmed those pages with the confidence of someone who believes paperwork exists to slow down less capable people, while my daughter-in-law pretended to read, nodding at paragraphs she never truly absorbed. Because arrogance creates a dangerous illusion that success itself guarantees protection, and once the agreement was signed, I watched their behavior change almost immediately, because certainty makes people careless. They started speaking more freely, planning more loudly, treating the estate as if it already belonged to them, telling friends about future renovations, guest lists, and views they hadn't yet earned, and all the while, they spoke of the anonymous investor with casual dismissal, a faceless entity whose role ended the moment the deposit cleared, never once considering that anonymity is often chosen by those with the most to lose, or the most to gain. And as the weeks passed and the closing date approached, I said nothing, asked nothing, remained exactly as they expected me to be, because the more confident they became, the more irreversible their assumptions felt. And irreversible assumptions are the easiest to dismantle, because people don't prepare defenses against what they believe is impossible, and late at night, sitting quietly with the reports Ruth sent me, I could see how every step they celebrated rested on one final approval that had not yet been given, one release of funds that could turn certainty into collapse, and knowing that didn't make me eager, it made me patient. Because power doesn't rush, it waits for the moment when resistance would cost the other side everything. And as my daughter-in-law laughed one evening about how no one could stop this deal now, I understood that the trap wasn't sprung by deception. It was sprung by belief, their belief that nothing stood between them and the future they'd already claimed, and belief, once locked in, has a way of blinding people right up until the second it betrays them. They thought the hardest part was over, but the only signature that truly mattered hadn't been given yet. Have you ever been given an ultimatum that revealed exactly how little you were valued long before the words were spoken? Because the day my daughter-in-law slid those papers across the table toward me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, I knew this wasn't about efficiency or convenience. It was about erasure made official. And the way she tapped the page and told me to sign quickly, as if my signature were nothing more than a formality standing between them and the life they believed they'd earned, confirmed what I already understood, that in their minds, I wasn't a person anymore, I was an obstacle, and obstacles are meant to be cleared, not considered. And when I glanced down and saw the heading printed boldly at the top, granting permanent and irrevocable authority over the remaining property tied to my name, something almost like amusement passed through me, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. Because people who feel entitled always want control wrapped in politeness. And as my son moved closer and lowered his voice, telling me that if I didn't sign, whatever relationship we had left would be over. The weight of that threat landed differently than he expected, because relationships built on obedience aren't relationships at all, they're leverage. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel afraid of losing it. And the room seemed to hold its breath as I turned the document over slowly and placed it face down, folding my hands on top of it without saying a word, because silence, when everyone expects compliance, is unsettling. It forces people to confront the possibility that control isn't guaranteed, and I could feel the pressure building around me, the subtle shifts, the clearing of throats, the tightening of jaws, because they were used to people responding, agreeing. Yielding, not pausing, not choosing stillness, and my daughter-in-law tried again, her tone tightening as she insisted it was just paperwork, just a formality, just something to help her son. As if framing it as generosity would make it so. And when my son spoke louder, telling me I had no reason not to sign, I leaned back slightly and let the words hang unanswered, because I had learned that explanations invite debate. And debate is what people use to wear you down, and as the seconds stretched, I watched certainty begin to crack, just enough to let doubt seep in, and that doubt mattered, because doubt is contagious in rooms built on confidence. And I didn't need to raise my voice or defend myself or justify anything, because the power had already shifted in a way they couldn't name. And as my daughter in law glanced around, searching for support that didn't come, I knew she felt it too, that subtle loss of footing that happens when the script you've rehearsed stops working. And I remained exactly where I was, calm, composed, letting them exhaust themselves against my refusal to react. Because sometimes the most effective way to say no is to stop playing the game entirely. And as the tension thickened and impatience sharpened into something closer to fear, I understood that this wasn't the moment for revelation yet. It was the moment for discomfort, for letting them feel what it was like to need something from someone they'd already decided was disposable. They thought my signature would save them, but before I said a word, the door opened and everything changed. Have you ever felt certainty collapse so fast you could almost hear it crack? Because that's what happened in the seconds after the door opened, and the atmosphere shifted from pressure to paralysis. When the confidence my son and daughter in law had been wearing like armor suddenly looked thin, brittle, and poorly fitted. And the man who walked in didn't look at them first, didn't acknowledge their urgency or their expectations, but instead came straight toward me with a nod that carried more respect than I'd been shown in years. And in that moment, I felt the balance of the room tilt, not dramatically, not loudly, but unmistakably, because respect has weight, and when it's directed somewhere unexpected, everyone notices. And as he spoke, calmly explaining that the final documents had been prepared according to my instructions, and that without my approval, the entire transaction would be canceled immediately. The silence that followed wasn't confusion, it was recognition arriving late, and I watched it register first in my son's eyes, the way confidence drains when the ground you're standing on turns out not to be solid after all. Followed closely by my daughter in law's disbelief, her lips parting as if to argue, and then stopping when she realized she didn't yet understand what she was arguing against. Because confusion is terrifying to people who are used to control, and when the explanation came, clear and unembellished, that I wasn't a decorative name on paperwork or a technicality to be pushed aside, but the legal owner of the land and a controlling force in the development itself, the room seemed to contract around that truth, pulling every breath tighter. And it wasn't triumph I felt then, it was relief, the kind that comes when reality finally catches up to arrogance. Because for the first time in a long while, I wasn't being spoken over or around, I was being addressed. And the looks that followed were different from the ones I'd grown used to, no longer dismissive or indulgent, but cautious, attentive. Recalculating, and my daughter in law turned sharply toward my son, her certainty breaking into sharp whispers that couldn't stay contained, accusing him of misleading her, of calling me irrelevant, of assuring her that I was nothing more than a formality. And watching them turn on each other in that moment taught me something important. People united by convenience rarely stay loyal once consequences appear. And I let the silence stretch just long enough for everyone in the room to understand that this wasn't a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over or a mistake that could be quietly corrected. This was the result of years of assumptions coming due all at once, and when I finally spoke, my voice was calm, steady, and free of emotion, not because I felt none, but because emotion wasn't necessary anymore. Explaining simply that my role here had been misunderstood, and that I was in no hurry to correct that misunderstanding until now, because timing matters. And I watched my daughter in law's expression shift from anger to calculation as she tried to assess whether charm, pressure, or outrage would work next, and realized none of them would, because once power becomes visible, pretending it doesn't exist only makes things worse. And as the attorney confirmed that nothing could proceed without my signature, that no buyer, no urgency, no argument could bypass that reality, I understood that this was the moment I'd been waiting for, not to reclaim the house, not to humiliate them publicly, but to decide what this situation would become, because control isn't proven by taking what others want. It's proven by choosing what happens next, and as I leaned back and let the room sit with that uncertainty, I could see the panic beginning to surface, because for the first time they weren't asking how to win. They were wondering how much they were about to lose. They finally understood who held the power, but they still had no idea what I planned to do with it. Have you ever realized that the most powerful decision isn't taking something back, but choosing who was never meant to have it in the first place? Because as I sat there with every eye in the room fixed on me, waiting for anger, demands, or some dramatic declaration, I felt none of those things, only a calm certainty that surprised even me. Because revenge that simply reverses positions still leaves you tied to the same game, and I had no interest in winning a game built on cruelty, so instead of signing what they expected, I reached into my bag and placed a different set of documents on the table, papers prepared quietly over weeks, cleared by city offices, reviewed by lawyers who didn't know my family and didn't need to, and as I began to sign, I felt my daughter-in-law lean forward in anticipation, her confidence briefly returning as she assumed the story was swinging back in her favor, until the heading caught her eye and confusion spread across her face. Because these weren't transfer papers into their hands, they were documents assigning the entire estate to a nonprofit foundation dedicated to housing elderly women who had been abandoned, overlooked, or quietly pushed aside by their families, and the shift in the room was immediate, not outrage yet, but disbelief, because generosity is unsettling when it appears where entitlement expects reward. And as the reality settled in that the house they had already furnished in their minds would never belong to them, not now, not ever, I saw something deeper than anger surface, something like panic, because status can be replaced. Money can be earned again, but reputation, once rewritten publicly, is almost impossible to recover. And that was the part they hadn't anticipated, because in the final clause of those documents, written clearly enough that no one could pretend they'd misunderstood, their names were listed as honorary sponsors, permanently attached to a gift they had tried to control, ensuring that every mention, every dedication, every public record would carry their identities alongside a legacy of compassion they had never intended to create. And watching them realize they couldn't escape that association was strangely peaceful. Because it wasn't punishment delivered with anger, it was consequence delivered with permanence. And when the confirmation came that everything would be finalized immediately, that the estate would open its doors to women who knew exactly what it felt like to be erased, I felt something lift inside me, a weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying, because for the first time, the narrative wasn't about what had been taken from me, it was about what I chose to give. And that choice made all the difference, because my son's voice broke when he asked what I was doing. And I told him evenly that I was making sure the house was used for good and that his name would be remembered, just not in the way he imagined. And in that moment, the power dynamic fully inverted. Because they weren't being pushed aside the way they'd pushed me, they were being rendered irrelevant to the outcome entirely. And irrelevance is far more difficult to fight than injustice. And as they stood there surrounded by witnesses who now understood exactly what had happened, I realized that the most lasting consequences aren't loud. They're documented, archived, and remembered long after emotions fade. And as I gathered my things and prepared to leave, I knew the story wasn't over yet, because decisions like that don't just change rooms, they ripple outward, touching reputations, relationships, and futures in ways no one can control once they're released. They lost the house in that room, but the real consequences were already moving far beyond it. Have you ever wondered what people do when the world they built on arrogance finally collapses and there's nowhere left to turn? Because it was only a few months after the closing that I heard the knock, not loud, not confident, but hesitant, the kind of knock that asks permission rather than announces presence. And when I opened the door and saw my son and his wife standing there with faces that looked thinner, older, drained of the certainty they once wore so comfortably, I understood immediately that this moment wasn't about apology. It was about survival, because reputation doesn't fall all at once. It fractures slowly, business deals evaporate quietly, invitations stop coming, phone calls go unanswered. And the same people who once leaned in close now cross the street to avoid recognition, and I watched it happen from a distance as their lives began shedding the symbols they once used as proof of worth. The luxury car sold first. Then the boat, then the house they swore was temporary until something better came along, until temporary became permanent and excuses replaced plans. And standing there on my doorstep, my son spoke softly, saying they didn't have anywhere else to go, that they just needed a little time, a little help, as if help were something that could be requested without memory attached. And I invited them inside not because they deserved it, but because clarity deserves space. And as they sat across from me at the table, hands folded, eyes lowered, the imbalance was unmistakable, not because I'd raised my voice or claimed superiority, but because power had finally settled where it belonged. And when I spoke about the nursing home nearby, clean and well run, repeating the very words once thrown at me with such ease, I watched understanding land with precision, not cruelty. Because cruelty had never been the point, consequence was, and they left without arguing, without shouting. Because some doors close so quietly there's nothing left to say, and when I stood on the porch watching them disappear down the path, the air felt lighter, not triumphant, just resolved, and later that afternoon I found myself back in the garden, my hands in the soil, the rhythm familiar and grounding. Because life has a way of returning you to what's honest once the noise fades, and as the sun dipped lower and the chickens wandered close, unconcerned with status or loss, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, peace without vigilance. Because the ledger I'd been keeping so carefully was finally balanced, not through anger, not through revenge, but through choice, and standing there with dirt on my hands and quiet all around me, I understood that silence had never been weakness. It had been strategy, a pause long enough to let the truth reveal itself fully, and when it finally did, I spoke once clearly and let the consequences do the rest, because sometimes the strongest ending isn't loud, it's final. And sometimes the quietest person in the room is only quiet because they're waiting for the exact moment when words are no longer necessary. Silence isn't surrender, it's timing, and when spoken at the right moment, it becomes consequence.